If you want to learn about bird migration in the Pacific Flyway, you're in the right place. If you're a bird photographer, you need to understand bird migration in order to make better wildlife photos and be at the right place at the right time to do so. Hello and welcome. I'm Kirby Flanagan. I'm a wildlife and nature photographer, as well as your host for this 99th episode of the Photographing the West podcast. Today I'm joined by Shannon Rio, a birder and a bird behaviorist who's studied the birds and their behavior for 20 years. Although I've spent months studying bird migration and months studying the birds of the Klamath Basin, she knows these birds and their migration patterns firsthand. So welcome, Shannon. Today we're going to talk about migration in general and in particular, migration in the Pacific Flyway, and then use our collective experience with the Klamath Basin to illustrate some of what's known about bird migration. Shannon, where is the Klamath Basin and what's so special about it?
This map is very helpful for explaining it. We have the California-Oregon border. That's a vertical line on the lower aspect of this map. So you see it's both in California and Oregon, but primarily in Oregon. A basin is a geological depression where water collects, and this is very significant for the creation of marshes and these areas of standing water. If you notice, there are 6 different regions that are green. 6 different areas make up the actual wildlife refuge. They're not connected. Today, we're going to particularly talk about the 2 that are on the Oregon-California border, the Lower Klamath Refuge and the Tule Lake Refuge.
What changes have you seen in tracking technology over the years, Shannon?
Well, to understand migration, and let me first say I work with the Klamath Bird Observatory, which is a science-based organization that's purpose is to study migratory birds and their migratory pathway. Traditionally, banding has been used, a very important aspect of science, very labor-intensive, very demanding work, but it has given us lots of information about the status of certain birds, their decline, how well they're doing, effects of climate change. Now we've got new technology. We've got these great little miniature GPS backpacks that we can put on certain birds. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it gives us much more specific information because we can get information from cell towers and other towers called MODIS towers that let us know the pathway of a migratory bird through the migratory year.
This is a conventional view of U.S. flyways. We're accustomed to thinking of flyways as well-defined waterfowl superhighways, but the truth is much more complex, as we'll see in this next slide. This shows the flyways for waterfowl, specifically ducks and geese. You'll notice some overlap between the Pacific Flyway and the...
Looks like the Rocky Mountain Flyway.
Right. You'll also notice on the East Coast that these flyways overlap as well, the Atlantic and the Midwest. So it's much more complex than we're brought up to believe as school kids. There are several types of flyway categories as defined by scientists. It's not so important that you understand what each of these are, but more understand that there's more than one sort of migration pattern. So resident birds are present year-round and never migrate. The further south you go, the more likely birds are to be resident. For example, in the Klamath Basin, there are a few resident bald eagles and golden eagles, and many more migratory ones. Facultative migration describes birds that only migrate under certain conditions, usually weather or climate related. They stay on their nesting grounds if weather is mild and food supply is adequate. Obligate migrants follow a set pattern every year like ducks and geese, what we usually think of as migration. Partial migrants are species where some migrate and some don't. For example, the bald eagles I mentioned before. Nomadic migrants follow only very general patterns of migration, snowy owls being a good example. Finally, if you know anything about birds, it's readily apparent that many of these patterns overlap. Next, we're going to talk about drivers of migration. Why do birds migrate? There are multiple reasons as outlined here, and we'll discuss this in more detail as we discuss individual birds. But obviously, it's very complex. And although a lot of birds migrate on the basis of photo period or the length of the day, others migrate based on other things or a combination of things. Very few birds, like homing pigeons, navigate almost entirely by smell, while most others navigate by a combination of methods. Next, we're going to talk about migration and navigation. Birds that migrate at night typically use the stars. Ones that migrate during the day use a combination of the above, and again, it varies from species to species. Now we're going to talk about northern pintail migration as our first instance of one type of bird migration. These dabbling ducks may arrive in the Klamath Basin as early as August. Fall migration occurs in large flocks of hundreds to thousands of birds, usually in groups with long, wavy, irregular lines, with individuals flying abreast.
The pintail is known as one of the most elegant of ducks. It's called the greyhound of the sky. It also has the nickname of sprig. And and the females, by the way, most ducks, females quack, males make other sounds. The males make a beautiful whistling sound. Okay, let's look at the distribution map for the pintail.
So the brown areas indicate breeding locations, mostly in the north, as is typical for ducks and geese in particular. Migration occurs in the east along the northeast corridor and in the Midwestern states primarily. And then migration also occurs in Northern California and Southwest Nevada, and of course up into Oregon as well. Pintails are present year-round in these purple areas that you see right here.
And one of the things Kirby and I was talking about yesterday is I always used to assume when I looked at these maps that purple meant the birds were there all year round, same birds all year round, but actually the pintail, the species, is there all year round, but there's something called leapfrog migration where there might be some pintails who are going to come to the purple area for the winter, and some that are going to go all the way to Mexico. So again, like Kirby's saying, it's not just a cut and dried, clear definition of where birds are, and it's a little more complicated than that.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about habitat for the pintails. They gather in very large numbers in feeding flocks on open, shallow wetlands and flooded agricultural fields. They feed on grains, marsh plants, seeds, and aquatic invertebrates throughout the fall and winter. Overwintering and migratory flocks use shallow wetlands and flooded fields to roost and feed when they're not frozen. That's the lakes, of course. Larger lakes and reservoirs and various lake and river wetlands are also used. In addition to wetlands, they use flooded pastures and hay fields in southern Oregon, including the Klamath Basin and northern California. Now let's move on to migration patterns in detail.
Just one more thing to say about that. For those of us who go to the Klamath Basin often, those 6 areas of refuge are surrounded by agricultural fields, farms, ranches. When we do our birding trips there, which I've done with Kirby, we not only go to the refuge, but we go often to other to the landscape around the refuge, because as he said, those ducks are eating grains, waste grains in fields. So anyway, the Klamath Basin, it's rich not just for the refuge aspect, but for the whole thing.
And ducks and geese, of course, will go where the food is, like most birds. So they don't necessarily follow the refuge boundaries. And sometimes the best photography is off the refuge, but
That's right.
sometimes it's on the refuge. Talking about pintail migration, they're relatively early migrants. The Alaska birds migrate to California. They arrive in the Klamath Basin in the first week in August. Several 100,000 by mid-September. They're most abundant by December.
Something very interesting is people always ask me the best time of year to go to the refuge. And even though I think it's every single day of the year, there's actually a very famous bird festival there called Winter Wings that takes place in February, which is in the heart of cold weather. But people come from all over the country and even all over the world to come to this area in the winter. So believe it or not, December, January, and February are particularly good times to go.
Talking more specifically about the fall migration patterns, pintails are one of the first ducks to migrate south in the fall. First arrivals are usually adult males. They migrate from Alaska and the prairie potholes of Canada and the Dakotas to northeastern and central California, including the Klamath Basin. Large numbers also migrate through to the Great Salt Lake area, to California and Mexico, sometimes even bypassing the Klamath Basin. Other populations take a more direct route from Alaska to California across the Pacific Ocean, as well as south along the coast and via interior pathways to prairies, and again, ultimately, California, the Gulf Coast, and Mexico. More than 80% of Alaska banded birds migrate along the Pacific Flyway to fall wintering areas, mostly in California once again. They gather in large staged flocks to move to California. They migrate at night after sunset. Pintails usually depart from the Klamath Basin to the Central Valley as the lakes and ponds around the Klamath Basin begin to freeze up. In the spring, northward migration from winter locations begins in late January, but is heaviest in February. Most pintails leave wintering regions by late March and reach nesting regions in April and May. In the Pacific Flyway, peak initiation of migration is the first week of March. Important spring staging areas include the Klamath Basin. Spring migration generally follows a pattern similar to fall migration, but in reverse order, of course.
And, this just begs, it begs thinking about the big picture of migration, that these birds, migration is part of their life, and it takes an enormous amount of energy to migrate. And because of the great foresight of Teddy Roosevelt, in 1908, we have some protected land called the Lower Klamath Refuge. And then in 1928, we have some protected land called Tule Lake. And if you look along that protected flyway, or that Pacific Flyway, you see Sacramento Wildlife Refuge. That kind of foresight where land was set aside so the migrating birds could have places to rest, to eat, is what keeps those species alive. So, yay to wildlife refuges.
Amen to that. This slide shows specific information about what happens in the Klamath Basin as far as pintails and mallards begin to start migrating. And as you'll see, it starts in August and goes through into October here.
And the map is really good at showing how there's something happening all year round. So as a photographer, Kirby, do you have a best time of the year that you go there to photograph wild waterfowl?
Well, fall ends up being a pretty good time for ducks and geese. And then as you get more into the winter months, December and January, then you begin to see more hawks and bald eagles. So it depends on what you're looking for and what photographs you want to get. But there's several months in the fall that work really well for wildlife photographers. And so those are prime months to be there. But as you said earlier, there are multiple months of the year where there's something to shoot. But my interest is mainly in waterfowl and raptors. So that's when I head to Klamath. So moving on, we'll talk about snow goose migration. Snow geese, of course, are beautiful birds and among the most charismatic species that migrate to the Klamath Basin. In addition, migration includes white-fronted geese and tundra swans, which are also very beautiful birds. The Klamath Basin is still a major layover area for migratory birds from the Arctic and the prairie potholes of the American West and Canadian prairies. Thousands of geese, primarily white-fronted geese and snow geese, spend varying amounts of time in the Lower Klamath Refuge during fall migration. Snow geese migrate from Wrangel Island in the Russian Northeast and the Mackenzie River Delta in British Columbia to the mouth of the Columbia River, the Lower Klamath Refuge, and finally to the Central Valley of California. White-fronted geese breed in the delta of the Kuskokwim and Yukon rivers in Alaska. They migrate nonstop to the Klamath Basin starting in early September and then on to the Central Valley as the Klamath Basin freezes up. This slide shows the snow geese distribution map.
Kirby and I looked at this map yesterday and we're in awe at the large area that is yellow, the migratory landscape for the snow goose. And something that you really can't get from the pictures, but you will get from going there is the air is filled with the sound of the snow geese and the white-fronted geese, the Canada geese and the swans. And it can bring tears to your eyes because it is very, very powerful. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of these species are going to hang out in grain fields during the day. So they might be on the refuge or they might be on the roads around the refuge. And then at night, they'll go often to places where there's water. If you're familiar with the area, there's an area called Miller Island, favorite place for the geese to go to at night.
Yeah, where you find them also depends, obviously, I guess, on where the water is. And
Right.
in some years when it's particularly dry in the Klamath Basin, these ponds in the refuge may be very shallow or completely dry. So the geese will look elsewhere in the basin for places to forage and places to rest for the night. But generally they like to be in the water at night or concentrated in open fields for protection from predators like bald eagles and coyotes.
I know my husband and I go over there every week. And what's kind of mysterious in a way is the Board of Reclamation determines where water is. And so one week water could be in one field, and then the next week it could not be there and could be in another field. But that's all a part of, you never know what you're going to find. And that's the glory and the mystery of it.
And I think that's true of a lot of the Western refuges, because none of them, to my knowledge, have water rights. They get water after the farmers and the ranchers get there, and the Indians get their portion of the water, and then whatever's left over goes to the refuges. And in a good water year, that's no problem. If there's a drought, then it can be a serious problem in many ways for the refuges and the birds that like to use those refuges. So as we've mentioned already, snow geese like to be in the water like most ducks and geese. So they use tidal marshes of deltas dominated by bulrushes. So in other words, where rivers flow into marshes. They also like the agricultural fields, including waste potatoes, rye and wheat fields, and the open pasture grasses. Again, they usually use the marshes largely at night and farm fields during the day for protection. And they make greater use of farm fields during non-hunting season than during hunting season, for obvious reasons. So this shows typical snow goose habitat in the Klamath Basin with open fields, and it's a little hard to see, but there's actually water down here where you can kind of barely see. There's some geese in the water here around where these brown areas are. So they can shelter there, and also in the tall grasses that you see in the foreground and the background. Talking about fall migration patterns, snow geese are an annual medium distance migrant with long stopovers. About 90% of Wrangel Island breeders, that's up in northeast Russia, as I mentioned earlier, fly south to stopover areas in Chukotka, St. Lawrence Island, and along the west coast of Alaska in the Yukon and Kuskokwim River deltas. From that staging area where they feed and rest up, they move south along the Pacific Flyway to form two populations, with the northern population stopping in the Fraser River Delta in British Columbia and the Skagit River Delta in Washington State. The southern population continues on to southern Oregon and the Klamath Refuge and northern California. Besides the Klamath Basin, they're found very frequently around Chico, California and Sacramento, California. In spring, they reverse their fall migration pattern. Migration from wintering areas begins in February, with most snow geese arriving at their breeding grounds by mid to late May. They appear at most intermediate migration areas in March, with peak numbers in mid-April. In Northern California and Southern Oregon, they begin to depart in March and complete their departure by early April. Many factors influence timing and duration of spring migration from year to year, including increasing temperatures, inconsistencies of weather, and availability of food at stopover sites and on the breeding grounds. Northerly progress closely follows the disappearance of snow and ice, as you might expect. Once again, this shows the pattern specifically in the Klamath Basin. The first snow geese arrive in October and November, or maybe a bit earlier, with changes due to climate change. Moving on, we're going to talk about northern harriers. Do you have any comments about the harriers?
Just that I love them.
Me too.
These they're in the family of raptors. Raptors are those species that have talons beaks, and keen eyesight for eating meat. Harriers are unique in that family, in that they're known as marsh hawks. They're not like the bootios, which are the grand birds of the sky, or the accipiters that are in trees. They are marsh hawks. They actually have, if you can actually see it on this fantastic picture, a facial disc. You can see it right around the edge. That facial disc is the same facial disc that owls have, with asymmetrical ear holes. So that's right, where Kirby's putting those marks. So they harry, meaning they teeter close to the ground, hearing mice and other food sources, and then they pinwheel down to get it. Anyway, they're a beautiful bird. Another really interesting thing is males, females, and juveniles all look different, although you can pretty much tell them apart because of that long tail, and it's got a significant white patch at the base of the tail. Let's find out more about their migration.
So northern harriers are year-round residents of the Klamath Basin, but appear to be more numerous in winter. They are considered partial migrants, meaning that they don't all migrate. So again, we see a different migratory pattern from the other birds that we've discussed so far. However, some migrate distances of greater than 900 miles, especially in the northern portions of their range. They are known to fly more than 75 miles over water at times. Most northern harriers migrate alone during the day, but some fly at night. They occasionally soar, but usually engage in active flapping flight. Movement is associated with low pressure and the approach of a cold front, which includes rising air and southerly winds. They hunt on migration and hunt on the wing. This is made necessary by the flapping motion of their migration, which consumes a lot of energy. So they need to eat along the way to stay healthy and continue to fly. Looking at their distribution map, you can see that, again, in the purple area, they are present year-round. Northern Nevada, Eastern Oregon, and over the Great Basin in general. Like most birds, they migrate north for breeding, and then non-breeding birds are found mostly further south into Mexico and Central America. Any thoughts about that, Shannon?
It takes 2 years for a harrier to get its adult look. So, and then the male harrier has to display to get the girl, build a nest together on the ground, bringing sticks and grasses, which something I believe that a very good way to do photography and learning bird behavior is to sit in your car and just see what comes. So I have sat in my car and watched nest building between the mates of harriers on the ground. And that, you know, you don't think about it, but a lot of birds never do breed. They never do make the cut to breed. The strongest ones do breed. If you know much about mortality in the raptor family, there's about 60 to 70% mortality in the first year. So even surviving the first year is a big deal. But like Kirby says, there's going to be a lot of birds that are not going to successfully breed. And so they don't have to go to Alaska. They may stay in that year-round territory.
So where can you expect to find northern harriers? As I mentioned before, harriers forage on the wing, and you often see them flying low over open fields, looking for mice and voles. And they're pretty much the only hawk that I know of, at least, that hunts in this manner. So if you see a bird that looks like a hawk and is flying very low over an open field, the chances are pretty good that it's a northern harrier. Unlike other hawks, as Shannon mentioned, it frequently relies heavily on auditory cues as well as visual ones to capture prey. A ruff of facial hairs funnels sounds to acoustically sensitive ears similar to owls. Harriers can detect small ground-dwelling mammals hidden under a dusting of snow or weedy grass mats. What harriers mostly catch during wintertime are voles, but depending on the season, they may hunt for other prey depending on what's available. Let's look at fall migration patterns for the harriers. Unfortunately, migration patterns in the west have not been very well studied compared to those in the northeast. So the timing of fall migration at sites in Alaska, Rocky Mountains, and Great Basin is thought to be slightly earlier than in the east, and duration of passage is thought to be shorter. Whereas in the east, migration lasts up to 3 months. This time is thought to be shorter in the west, but nobody knows for sure because of a lack of studies. Northern harriers are a leapfrog migrant, with individuals from northern population wintering further south than southern population. As noted in this slide, most individuals migrate alone during the day compared to ducks and geese that migrate in large flocks and migrate primarily at night. So in the spring, again, this has not been well studied in the Pacific Flyway, but generally speaking, winter territories are abandoned and communal roosts disbanded in late February and early March. Like fall migrants, spring migrants exhibit a protracted migration period without a well-defined temporal peak. Again, this is probably not well-defined because of the lack of studies, unfortunately. So this slide shows when the hawk numbers begin to increase, including northern harriers. And as it indicates, it's late October, November, and on into December and January, when there are large numbers of hawks on the refuges. So that's an especially good time to be there if you want photos of hawks.
We're not going to talk about other hawks, but I just want to let you know that it's hard to travel a mile without seeing red-tailed hawks on multiple posts. Another very exciting hawk to see at that time of year is the rough-legged hawk, which right now my husband and I are going over there and loving being able to see this bird that breeds north but comes south to the refuge. This is its south to feed and to live. So be open to all. There's also ferruginous hawks. There's other hawks to be seen as well, and falcons. So
yeah, and red-shouldered hawks are seen at that time of year also, which are one of my favorite hawks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to explore the areas around the refuge because sometimes there's more in the fields north of the refuge than there are in the refuge itself. So it depends on the day, but taking enough time to investigate surrounding areas is well worthwhile if you're visiting the refuge in the south or visiting the refuge in midwinter. Photographers love bald eagles, so we're going to spend some time talking about bald eagles and their migration in the U.S. and especially in the Klamath Basin. The majority of wintering populations of bald eagles are located in the lower 48 states, coastal Canada, and Alaska. Bald eagles generally migrate alone, but occasionally join other migrants on the wing, but not in kettles or flocks as some other birds do. Concentrations of migrants can occur at communal feeding and roost sites during migration. While bald eagles in general are omnivores and opportunistic eaters everywhere, in Alaska they focus on fish primarily, usually salmon. In the lower 48, this is less true, probably because there are fewer fish in the south than in Alaska, And certainly the salmon runs are not nearly as large in the lower 48 as they are in Alaska.
Well, when you come to the basin in winter, you're going to see lots of ducks, lots of bald eagles sitting on the ground on ice or areas of water that are partial ice, waiting to eat a duck or a coot. I have lots of pictures of them chomping on widgeons and chomping on coots and eating ruddy ducks. And I was telling Kirby that when we go there and there are these huge gatherings of waterfowl, that I actually watch the waterfowl kind of fold in because they don't want to be next to the edge where they're more vulnerable to predation by a bald eagle. So anyway, like right now, if you go to Tule Lake, you'll just see a whole lot of bald eagles sitting out on the lake. So they're easy to see. Go ahead, Kirby.
Yep, that's very true. I've seen probably more there than any other place except Alaska. So there are other areas around the country where bald eagles congregate in the winter, usually around large rivers like the Mississippi River, where there are also large concentrations, or around large bodies of water. So while they are primarily a fish-eating species, as I stated earlier, they are omnivores, and they will eat most anything that comes to hand, including roadkill. So you may see them almost anywhere, but in the basin, they tend to be around the ponds where the ducks and geese are, waiting for an opportunity to snatch one of them up, or sometimes in the open fields around the refuge, looking for other things like rabbits and voles and mice. So again, in the Klamath Basin, they're looking for open water. And as Shannon said, because the ponds and marshes are shallow and not filled with fish, their diet is more concentrated on the waterfowl, looking for ones that are sick or injured or just slow moving. It's not unusual to see a bald eagle fly over a pond and clear every bird out of the pond because they know what's coming if they stay where they are. The best viewing opportunities are during January and February, when numbers may peak at over 500 birds. During this time, a lucky visitor may be able to spot dozens of bald eagles along the Tule Lake Refuge and Lower Klamath Refuge auto tours. With injuries, weakness, and diseases such as avian cholera claiming many waterfowl, it is easy for an eagle to catch a dead duck or goose. After consuming their fill of waterfowl, most eagles will leave the valley bottoms by late afternoon and head to sheltering night roosts, especially in the Bear Valley National Wildlife Refuge, which we saw on the map at the beginning. Here on the northeast facing slopes, night roosts protect the eagles from prevailing winter winds. Bear Valley National Wildlife Refuge, unfortunately, is closed to public access, and the land surrounding it is privately owned. So the only way to really see the birds as they fly out in the morning is to stick to the public roads in the area. So here's the bald eagle distribution map. And as noted with the waterfowl and other birds we've discussed, they breed in the north, and they're year-round in a lot more areas than actually show on this map now. I think this map must be a few years old, because over the last 20 years in particular, they've become common to see in large areas of the Midwest for sure, and I think large areas of the country in general. But again, they tend to be along rivers and streams and coastal areas where there's more opportunity for fishing and other foraging. Any thoughts?
No. Let's see the next slide.
All righty. As anybody that's observed eagles know, they tend to select large super canopy roost trees that are open. So you usually find a large eagle nest in the tops of the trees, particularly in large trees that are able to support the huge nests that the bald eagles build. Generally, they're going to be associated with aquatic foraging areas, but they're not necessarily as close to water as the nests typically are, especially in the West. Most roosts, however, are located in areas that are at least protected from prevailing winter winds, regardless of whether they occur in conifers or deciduous trees.
On the lower Klamath route, there is a nest that is used every year. They reuse nests. They build the largest nest of any bird in North America. They tend to have 2 eggs. They tend to mate for life and can live up to 25 years and actually even longer once they make it to adulthood, which it takes them 5 years to become looking like a bald eagle and a full adult. So winter's the best time to see them in profusion, but there are other times of the years where you can see them on the route because there are some that are there all year round. That nest is actually protected, however, because some people are disruptive around the nest. But anyway, you can see them all year round there.
Yeah, if that road you're talking about is open, that's a great opportunity because it's fairly close to the road and they're fairly tolerant of people. But I know during some of the time I've been there, they've blocked off that road because people don't use good sense and try to get too close and disturb the eagles.
Right.
So this is just one example of eagles that you might see in the Klamath Basin. I've seen the similar sites where there were a dozen or more bald eagles all in the same tree. And then there's other trees around the refuge where you can commonly see them. Even though this is a very dry area, there are a few trees around, and this seems to be where the bald eagles prefer to roost during the day while they're waiting for something to eat.
This photo is a very good example that you can be looking at a bald eagle and may not know it's a bald eagle if you go to the bird that is, if you look at this like a clock at 4 o'clock, it doesn't have a white head, and that means it is a younger bird. Bald eagles actually have a way they look when they're 1, 2, 3, and 4 before they get to year 5. They're always in a molt, but I like that. And plus, even though there's looks like a raven, some ravens in here, they all a little bit coexist. And I like seeing the ravens in this tree with the eagles.
Yeah,
Ravens do like to hassle eagles, just so you know. Ravens like to hassle anything, I think. So,
bald eagles are remarkably tolerant of smaller birds. You know, sometimes you see smaller birds chasing eagles, which seems like a death wish, but usually they get away with it and just chase the eagles away from areas that they don't want them.
that's right. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen a female red-winged blackbird chase everything from a bald eagle to a crane, but hey, that's called mama. That's called being a mama. And you don't want any bird near your kids, especially if they're thinking of eating it. So I agree, Kirby. You see a lot of small birds chasing larger birds.
So, as we mentioned in the case of other raptors, there are multiple migratory populations of bald eagles as well. Northern bald eagles, they're breeding north of 40 degrees north, which would be approximately the location of the Klamath Refuge on the California-Oregon border, or a little bit south of there. If they're in interior areas, including in Alaska, they generally migrate south from August through January, with immatures departing breeding grounds first and migrating further south to get away from mom and dad, no doubt. In the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and some parts of the Intermountain West, migratory movements coincide with salmon migrations. Immatures and adults in the Pacific Northwest migrate north up the coast in late summer to take advantage of the earlier salmon runs as far north as the Chilkat River near Haines, Alaska, which is famous amongst photographers for being a great place to find bald eagles in November, December. Adults and immatures from Alaska and the Pacific Northwest then follow the salmon runs south along the Pacific coast, and adults arrive on Pacific Northwest wintering grounds during November and December, while the immatures arrive later in January. Southern adults breeding south of 40 degrees north latitude usually do not migrate but remain around in the vicinity of the nest site. Most immature bald eagles migrate and move nomadically like teenagers everywhere. Adults migrate when the food runs out. And again, migrating bald eagles are typically loners.
Just to say, bald eagles, they're going to have 2 eggs. They're going to incubate them for more than a month. The babies are going to be born. They're going to be in the nest for several months, and then they're going to be around the parents for another few months, with the parents helping them find food. But at some point, the parents don't help them anymore, and that's when they leave. So anyhow.
Or get kicked out of the nest. So moving on to spring migration. The northern birds return to breeding grounds as soon as weather and food availability permits, generally January through March. Timing is variable from year to year based on weather and food. Spring migration is more directed over shorter periods of time than fall migration. In other words, they take their time in the fall and they go pretty quickly north as soon as things start to thaw out. They typically migrate by soaring on thermals and then gliding to the next thermal, again, conserving energy as much as possible. And here's another chart of when to find bald eagles in the Klamath Basin. Generally November, December, and even into the spring, you'll see large numbers of hawks as well as bald eagles. Now on to another one of my favorite birds, Sandhill Cranes. An awkward looking bird when they're on the ground, but beautiful in flight. And very elegant in flight, as I like to say. The migratory patterns of Sandhill cranes are among the most complex of any birds that I know of. In addition to there being 6 subspecies of Sandhill cranes, there are 6 migratory patterns that have been described. Today, we're only going to talk about the ones along the Pacific Flyway. The Klamath Basin is an important area for both breeding and migrating greater Sandhill cranes, and to a lesser extent, lesser Sandhill cranes. Historically, the Klamath Basin supported 18 to 20% of breeding crane pairs in Oregon and California. I'm not sure that's still true based upon my observations, at least. There don't seem to be large numbers as that percentage would suggest there any longer. In California, the Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge is considered one of the most important sites for staging Sandhill Cranes during fall migration from mid-September to mid-November, when over 1,500 cranes have been counted on a single day. Much like geese, cranes migrate in family groups. A pair of cranes that successfully fledged a young colt or a baby sandhill crane the previous summer will return with that bird on the migration north. Any thoughts, Shannon?
No, but that's very unusual, by the way. Most birds do not stay with their parents through a season, but that is the case with the sandhill cranes. They tend to have one or two colts. Their nest is on the ground or close to the ground. The babies are born precocial, meaning they get to stand up and be fully feathered. They're precocial 4, not 2. Precocial 4 means parents find them food. But it is very interesting that when they migrate in the fall, they will take their 1 or 2 colts with them. Very unusual.
So let's look at the distribution map again. The breeding areas are again in the north. The key staging areas up here in the prairie potholes and in the Great Lakes area. Move on to migratory areas. And there's a stopover site here along the Platte River, which is fairly famous. And there's also a stopover area in Eastern Oregon in the Klamath Basin, which is not really seen on this map, but certainly exists. And then they tend to overwinter in the south, most famously in southern New Mexico in Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. And they'll spend the winter down there and then migrate north again, passing through areas like the North Platte River and the Klamath Basin to head back to their northern breeding grounds up in Canada and Alaska. The lesser sandhill cranes are generally found farther north and primarily in Alaska and the northern parts of Canada, whereas in the Pacific Northwest, it tends to be largely the or greater sandhill crane, I'm sorry. But only occasionally will you see the lesser sandhill cranes, and I've seen that in the Klamath Basin again, but usually in small numbers. What's your experience?
I've never seen many of the lessers, so the greater sandhill cranes are what I see at the refuge, and I also love going to the Malheur Refuge, which is in Eastern Oregon. I know Sauvie Island is an area just outside of Portland where they are wintering. But again, they're primarily greater. Greater and the lesser look a lot alike. One's just bigger.
Habitat for sandhill cranes is similar to what you see in Bosque del Apache and also in Eastern Oregon, in that they will nest in marshes, bogs, wet meadows, anywhere where there's a little bit of water at least. They like to be out in the fields during the day feeding, and then at night they tend to collect either in large groups in the field or large groups in the water if available to protect themselves from predators. So looking for them around shallow fields and flooded fields are a good location anywhere in the Pacific Northwest at least, and again in southern U.S. and northern Mexico, including Bosque del Apache in southern New Mexico, which is well known and heavily visited by photographers because it's a great location, and there's Lots of water generally. There's lots of open fields, and the cranes are used to people, so you can get some excellent shots with a reasonable size lens. Anywhere from 300 to 600 millimeter lenses will give you beautiful shots of sandhill cranes, either feeding or flying.
It is said that they like to have their feet wet, and and I'm really interested in how different species relate to one another, what the circle is of all the connectivity of things. So, raccoons and coyotes can be predators of eggs and babies in nests. So it is said that sandhill cranes often might nest very near Canada geese, who are super protective of their babies and will alert cranes to a predator nearby.
I didn't know that. So a couple of sandhill cranes in flight on the Lower Klamath Refuge. You can see that it's very dry territory in the background, although there are ponds, as we've discussed earlier. So it's ideal territory for them as long as there's water nearby. And then a shot from Bosque del Apache, where you get beautiful sunsets and nice reflections on the water and large numbers of sandhill cranes, numbering in the thousands. So if you have the time and the money to make a trip to southern New Mexico in the November, December, January time. So in the fall, for all the populations, for all the 6 populations of sandhill crane, the timing of fall migration and their arrival on the wintering grounds varies greatly depending on the annual differences in winter severity in the north and in the south. Non-breeding and unpaired cranes begin fall migration before families being pairs of cranes and their colts, as we mentioned before. But the families actually arrive on wintering areas before the young. Unpaired cranes migrate faster in fall than during mild winters. Migration is later and migration distances can be shorter. So as mentioned earlier, the Central Valley Southern population, which is one of the 6, migrates to the Klamath Basin and Lake County in Oregon, which is southeast of the Klamath Basin. And then from there, as those lakes freeze up, they move on to the Central Valley of California, as well as to the Sacramento and Chico areas of Northern California. In the spring, migration is more regular, enabling predictable viewing for researchers, managers, and photographers. For example, cranes of the mid-continent population arrive with such regularity that the Audubon, Nebraska Society is able to host an annual spring crane festival in central Nebraska in the town of, or near the town of Kearney. And in California, there's a fall Sandhill Crane Festival at Lodi during the first few days of November, when both greater and lesser sandhill cranes arrive. During spring migration, pairs often arrive first on the breeding area, accompanied by offspring produced the previous year, and unpaired birds arrive a few weeks later. And another of the forms demonstrating the migration patterns in the Klamath refuges. So sandhill cranes begin to arrive in September and into early November. My experience is that they tend to arrive a little later than that now. What are your thoughts, Shannon?
I agree. And, we were talking yesterday about the word stage. how, you know, what it's significant to think about the whole Pacific Flyway, and that how much the refuge is needed for the cranes to come down and feed. You know, there might be a lot of food there, and so they might not keep going to Sacramento because like this year we had a really warm year, and maybe everything they need is there. And Kirby and I have both seen them further on in the winter in large numbers. So you never know what you're going to see.
Yeah, that's true. And if the marshes in the Klamath Basin are extremely dry, some birds, probably including the Sandhill Cranes, will just overfly the area and go on to
right.
areas around Sacramento or on into Utah, in areas of north of Salt Lake City, as well as in this Great Salt Lake area. Okay, we're now going to talk about different species, shorebirds. They're interesting because their migration patterns are totally different than any of the birds we've talked about up to this point. So Shannon's going to review patterns for a few of the shorebirds to get a feeling for how they differ from the birds we've talked about previously.
The Western grebe. So, well, first of all, this is a Western grebe. That's the baby on the back. They're going to come in the spring. And if you want to see babies on the back like that, you're going to be there in the summer. And in August, you're going to see the babies off the back yelling at their parents to continue to feed them. And then in the fall, they'll go back, and let's look at where they live in the winter next. I think our distribution map might be next.
Here we are.
Yeah. So again, Kirby and I kind of reviewed this yesterday. So what you're going to see right now in our next few species are birds of the water, of the coast, that come inland basically to areas in the Great Basin to breed. And Kirby was saying, why are they doing that? And, you know, I've been thinking about it since Kirby asked me that yesterday. Well, just like the waterfowl that we saw, the ducks and the geese and the eagles and the raptors go to Alaska and go north to breed, it's because the days are long and the food is there, and that's where they can successfully breed. So we're going to see birds that winter at the coast actually come in to sagebrush steppe, but also places that have water to do their breeding. And the Western grebe is one example of that. You're going to see a lot of them. You're going to see them dancing in May. You're going to see them in Tule Lake. You're going to see them in Klamath Lake, the upper Klamath Lake. And it's pretty spectacular, frankly, to see the Western grebe.
Yep, they're beautiful birds. And this dancing behavior is just spectacular. You've seen it, I haven't, but talk about that.
They do this spectacular dance. You can actually, like you can Google anything. You can Google and see a YouTube of Western grebes dancing, and you get to see it on your screen, which is how we're seeing everything these days. But they rise up out of the water and they patter along like that. Grebes are diving ducks, so their feet are very, very behind them in the body rather than the dabbling ducks, dabbling waterfowl that have their feet midway. And that allows them to lift off and be vertical like this. Could be for 2 seconds, could be for 10 seconds, could be for 30 seconds, could be for 60 seconds, unusually so. But it's quite spectacular. And that is their behavior that signals mating.
Another
And then you have the willet. Oh man, the willet. And you know, the same thing, you know, I'll never forget the first time I saw the willet in the sagebrush, and they make this wonderful woo, 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 willet sound that I'm used to hearing at the coast. But of course, it's a male on a post saying, this is my territory, come mate with me. So they're a shorebird. They're going to have long legs. They're going to have a significant bill for probing. They're going to nest on the ground like avocets, like stilts, like killdeer. They're going to build a scrape. That's the name of their nest, meaning they just scrape away some ground, lay 4 eggs, incubate for 25 days. And then when those babies are born, little baby Willets are born, they're precocial 2, meaning they, within a few hours, they stand up, their eyes are open, they're fully feathered, and they feed themselves on the first day they're born. But then the parents stay with them for a few more weeks. Willets. They nest in colonies. So here, this is what we're talking about. There they are in the winter over at the coast. And then lo and behold, they're in eastern Oregon and they're in the Klamath Basin, and they're in parts of the Great Basin where there's a combination of sage and shallow water. Same with ibis, another beautiful shorebird. This one, not so much. I don't go to the coast of Oregon to see a ibis. I go further south to Mexico, but got a beautiful probing bill. It's called the White-Faced Ibis because the area right at the base of the bill is literally the scientific place where the face is. It's the least thing you see when you see this bird because it is an iridescent copper green, gorgeous, tall shorebird that probes with that magnificent beak. And you'll see them coming to the Klamath Basin in the spring and probing. They love mud. They like to have their feet wet. And let's see our next picture. Yeah, wow. They really live year round, very, very far south. But in the Americas, there you see they are not at the coast so much, but they come to parts of the Great Basin to breed, including the Klamath Refuge. Avocet, could there be a more beautiful bird? Shorebird, long legs, shorebird bill. The only difference between the male and the females is the female's bill is a little more curved. It's a very subtle thing. Avocets get this beautiful coloration of reddishness only in breeding. They're actually white when they're non-breeding. And they actually have a bill that swipes the water back and forth as their way of feeding through that method. Anyway, they'll be at the basin. They'll be precocial, nesting on the ground, 4 eggs. And all these birds do the same, act like their wings broken if you get near their nest, which is distracting you away from the nest. There you have it. Not just the Great Basin, but actually that other marvelous area of the country. But I don't spend much time there. I'm at Klamath and Malheur during breeding seasons and Summer Lake. There's look for refuges. That's where you'll find magnificent birds.
Here's some of the references used for some of the information and diagrams, mostly from the Cornell lab, which is a wonderful location for finding information about birds, bird photographs, bird songs. So if you want to identify a bird or learn more about the birds, that's an excellent place to go. A great book on bird migration is called Living on the Wind by Scott Weidensaul. It's quite a long book, but it's an excellent book and very good, very well written and very good reading. So well worth the purchase. And he's written many books on various subjects, but particularly this one I like a lot, having read it and studied it and discussed it with Scott on one of my earlier podcasts. Klamath Basin has its own Audubon Society. There's a great deal of information on their website if you want more information about the Klamath Basin and when to go. And it includes a large amount of information on surrounding areas as well. They have a nice guide that shows you where to go, when to go, and has some good photos in it. So they're good people and well worth contacting if you're heading to that part of the country. And then finally, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the parent organization of the National Wildlife Refuges, is a good source of information on their website, and as well as the individual websites for various refuges. So before we go, let me just wrap up a little bit. The purpose of this was to give you information that would be helpful in finding birds that you might be seeking, as well as knowing when to go and where to go. I hope that we've accomplished that. If you have any questions, certainly email me at Kirby@FlanaganFotos.com. Flanagan Photos spelled FLANAGANFOTOS. These podcasts are published on the 15th and 30th of each month, except February, of course, and cover a variety of topics related directly to photography or indirectly, as in today's podcast. Knowing the biology and the habits of the birds you're trying to photograph is of great importance if you want to be able to be in the right place at the right time and get good shots. So well worth investing time in learning the biology of the birds that you want to photograph. So,
if you have any questions for me, let me just say that I am available also at shannonrio@aol.com. There's my name at aol.com. I welcome questions, comments, anything. And then I also encourage you to look at the Klamath Bird Observatory, the science organization that I am wedded to as a source of information about migratory birds, how to protect them. And we also have a lot of classes that we do right now on Zoom and outings once COVID will allow that. And in fact, that's how I met Kirby Flanagan. So there you have it.
okay. Thank you, Shannon, for all your help with this. And thanks to those photographers that allowed us to use their photographs as part of this podcast. So we'll see you back on January 30th for the 100th podcast. And this will be with Jim Zuckerman, and we'll talk about artificial intelligence and the new AI supported software for photography and developing your photos. Bye for now. And thanks
Bye.
for listening and watching.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.